For years, the small wooden cabin by the edge of Clearwater Beach had stood quietly, half hidden behind dunes and seagrass. It was a modest structure, weathered by salty winds, sun-bleached, and occasionally kissed by the mist of incoming tides. To most people walking by, it looked like a leftover from a bygone era, a remnant of old beachside living before modern resorts took over the coastline. But to one man, Daniel, it was more than a structure. It was a part of his family's history. His grandparents had built the cabin in the 1960s, a place where summer memories were made and where life slowed down to the rhythm of the waves. Though Daniel lived 2 hours inland now, he'd kept the cabin maintained as best as he could. Every few months, he'd visit to clean, repair, and ensure it remained secure. In the off-season, he installed security cameras around the property, small, discreet ones that blended into the old wood and rafters. They weren't for paranoia, but for peace of mind. Vandalism and trespassing weren't uncommon along that stretch of beach, especially since the area had recently become part of a gated community overseen by an aggressive new homeowners association. The Clearwater Dunes HOA had been formed only 3 years ago, and since then, things had changed. The group was led by a woman named Whitmore, a self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood standards. She was known for her flyers, constant patrols, and strict enforcement of arbitrary rules. If a mailbox was the wrong color, she noticed. If grass grew an inch too tall, she sent letters. And if someone didn't fit her idea of the ideal community member, she made their life miserable. Daniel had heard whispers about her antics, but he didn't pay much attention. The cabin, he believed, was safe. It sat just outside the main cluster of homes, technically still part of the HOA jurisdiction, but far enough away that no one seemed to bother. Or so he thought. That changed one weekend in late September. Daniel hadn't been to the cabin in 2 months. Work had been demanding, and he'd planned to visit in mid-October for his usual round of maintenance. But an unexpected notification from his security system changed everything. It came late at night, motion detected on the front porch camera. At first, Daniel assumed it was a raccoon or maybe the wind knocking something loose. But when he opened the feed, his heart dropped. There were people, 2 of them, standing at the door. One held a flashlight scanning the lock. The other was taking photos of the property. He watched stunned as the woman pointed at the porch, the windows, even the mailbox, as if documenting evidence. Then she walked right up to the camera, and Daniel recognized her face from local HOA newsletters posted online. Whitmore. Over the next hour, the feed showed them moving around the property, inspecting every inch. At one point, Karen made a phone call, pacing in front of the cabin with a smug expression. Then they left, but not before she placed a bright orange notice on the door. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He drove to the cabin early the next morning, and when he arrived, the sight made his stomach twist. The orange paper flapped in the sea breeze, stamped with the HOA's logo. It read, "Notice of Abandonment, Property Under Ho Review." The message claimed the structure had been unoccupied for an extended period, and that the HOA had reason to believe it was abandoned and subject to reclamation under neighborhood improvement guidelines. Reclamation. Daniel couldn't believe it. The HOA had no right to reclaim anything. The property deed was in his name, taxes were paid, and the cabin was legally registered with the county. This was trespassing, plain and simple. He tore the notice down, took photos, and began calling the HOA office. But no one answered. The number listed redirected to a generic voicemail that claimed office hours were currently suspended due to maintenance. Something felt wrong. Later that evening, he checked the other security feeds. What he saw next made his skin crawl. After he'd left that morning, Karen and her companions had returned. They weren't just inspecting this time, they were moving things, boxes, suitcases, and what looked like furniture. By sunset, a light was glowing inside the cabin. Someone was living there. Daniel's pulse pounded as he replayed the footage again and again. They had moved into his cabin, and they were doing it under the guise of HOA authority. He didn't want to act rashly. He decided to document everything. Every clip, every notice, every date and time. He gathered the property deeds, his tax receipts, and the original building permit signed by his grandfather decades ago. If the HOA thought they could take his property, they were in for a fight. But he had no idea just how far Karen was willing to go, or how deep the HOA's web of manipulation would reach. Because what started as a trespassing case would soon uncover corruption, forged documents, and an HOA scandal that stretched far beyond one beach cabin. And as the tide rolled in that night, Daniel knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of power that thrived on intimidation. As the waves crashed against the shore, the faint glow of his stolen home shimmered in the distance, and Daniel quietly promised they'd pick the wrong person to mess with. The morning after Daniel discovered the footage of Karen and her accomplices moving into his cabin, the quiet stretch of Clearwater Beach no longer felt like home. The sea breeze that once carried the smell of salt and serenity now seemed to carry tension and trespass. His family's beach cabin, the same place where his grandparents had spent decades of summers, was now occupied by people who didn't belong there, people who believed a flimsy HOA notice gave them ownership rights. Daniel didn't rush back immediately. Instead, he spent the next 2 days preparing. He downloaded every second of video footage from the cameras and stored it in multiple places: cloud storage, external drives, even printed timestamps. He knew people like Karen. They thrived on intimidation, on making others second-guess themselves. The only thing stronger than their arrogance was their fear of exposure. Still, Daniel couldn't shake off the unease. When he drove past the community's front gate that weekend, he noticed something different. The Clearwater Dunes HOA had installed a new sign: Private Community, Approved Residents Only. Beneath it, in smaller print, was the phrase enforced by HOA. Security. He'd seen this place evolve from a simple beachside neighborhood to something resembling a gated compound. While under Karen's rule, as he pulled up the narrow dirt road toward his property, his stomach tightened. The cabin was alive with activity. A silver SUV was parked by the dune path, its tires half buried in sand. A garden chair had been placed on the porch, and flower pots lined the steps, none of which belonged to him. The wooden shutters had been painted a pale blue. Curtains now hung in the windows. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air. They had moved in. Karen had completely taken over. On the front door was a laminated HOA posting declaring the cabin under interim management for community safety. It claimed that the abandoned property had been temporarily assigned to an HOA board member for maintenance and oversight until ownership verification could be completed. It was clear Karen was the one living there, or at least using it. Daniel didn't confront her that day. He stayed in his car for a long time, watching from a distance. His camera lens zoomed in from the dashboard. At one point, Karen appeared on the porch in a sun hat, sipping from a glass and scrolling through her phone like she owned the view. Behind her, a younger man, likely her son or one of her helpers, carried boxes inside. She looked relaxed, smug even. Every movement radiated the kind of confidence that came from believing no one would stop her. When Daniel finally drove away, he wasn't angry. He was calculating. He knew that storming in would give her leverage. Karens like her thrived on escalation, on painting themselves as victims when caught in the wrong. So instead, he turned to the law. That night, Daniel began making calls. He contacted the county property office, providing them with the deed and ownership history. The clerk confirmed that his name was still listed as the rightful owner. The HOA, she explained, had no authority to reclaim private property unless it was under foreclosure, and his taxes were up to date. It was clear that Karen had fabricated her claim, but proving it would take time, and the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. Meanwhile, his cabin was being redecorated. The next set of footage confirmed it. The cameras, though small and hidden, captured every change: Karen's new furniture, the arrival of rugs, and even a welcome mat that read "Our Happy Place." Daniel watched in disbelief as they rearranged his family heirlooms, took down old framed photos, and replaced them with generic coastal decorations. One night, the footage showed them hauling out boxes of his grandparents' keepsakes, items Daniel had carefully preserved for decades, and in tossing them into trash. Because each frame was a violation, he tried calling the HOA's listed number again, but it was useless. He sent certified letters to the HOA office demanding an explanation, but they went unanswered. The HOA website itself had been redesigned, plastered with Karen's smiling face under the title HOA President, Clearwater's Guardian. Her control wasn't just physical, it was administrative. She had woven herself into every corner of the neighborhood's governance. Still, Daniel knew something about bullies. They never expected to be watched. He drove back to the beach under the cover of dusk, parking far from the main road. With a flashlight dimmed to its lowest setting, he approached the back of the cabin. The place was quiet except for the steady hum of the ocean and the occasional creak of floorboards inside. Through one of the rear windows, he saw a flicker of light. Karen was watching television, feet propped on the coffee table, completely at ease. Daniel slipped behind a dune and checked the feed from his phone. Every camera was still active. They hadn't noticed them. Every move they made was being recorded. It gave him a strange sense of calm. Proof, he thought, was the ultimate weapon. Over the next few days, he compiled his evidence, photos, footage, official property documents, and timestamps. He even visited a lawyer recommended by a friend. The lawyer's reaction was one of disbelief that quickly turned into outrage. "They broke into your property, changed the locks, and moved in." She said, "That's not HOA oversight. That's criminal trespassing and property theft." The lawyer assured him that the law was on his side, but warned that HOAs often played dirty. "Expect them to stall to claim misunderstanding," she said. "People like that think community bylaws make them above real law." And she was right, because the very next day, Daniel received an official-looking envelope in the mail, stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a notice of hearing. It accused him of neglecting community property and failing to maintain safety standards. It also stated that, until ownership was resolved, the HOA had designated temporary custody of the property to an acting member, Karen Whitmore. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. It twisted the truth, framed Daniel as negligent, and justified their actions with legal jargon. But Daniel had what they didn't: proof. He decided to wait. He would let them dig deeper, let their lies pile up until they couldn't escape. Meanwhile, he would keep collecting footage, every night and every movement. 2 weeks later, his patience paid off. One of the cameras caught something new: Karen meeting with 2 men at the cabin, one of them wearing a shirt labeled HOA Enforcement. They discussed something near the porch, pointing at documents and laughing. Then one of them handed Karen a set of envelopes. She opened them, smiled, and tucked them into her purse. Daniel zoomed in on the papers later. The resolution wasn't perfect, but one phrase was visible: property transfer form. They were trying to forge ownership. That was the moment Daniel knew this was no longer just about an HOA overstepping its bounds. This was organized fraud. And with every passing day, Karen was writing her own downfall, in high definition. As the sun set over Clearwater Beach, the cabin glowed warmly with stolen light. Karen sat inside, confident in her little kingdom, unaware that every smug smile, every forged paper, every whispered scheme was being recorded. Daniel watched from his screen miles away, the ocean waves crashing faintly in the background. And he knew the storm was coming, and when it hit, it wouldn't be the kind the HOA could control. The sun rose quietly over Clearwater Beach, casting a soft golden hue across the water, a beautiful contrast to the tension that now ruled Daniel's days. From the outside, everything looked serene: waves lapping against the shore, gulls circling above, and a cabin that seemed like the perfect coastal retreat. But inside, Daniel's family property was no longer his refuge. It had become the headquarters of a hostile takeover, one orchestrated by the HOA's queen of control, Karen Whitmore. 2 weeks had passed since she'd claimed the cabin as abandoned and moved in under the guise of community oversight. In that time, Daniel's cameras had captured hours upon hours of incriminating footage. Every clip told a story of arrogance, of entitlement wrapped in polite justification. Karen's movements were methodical. She treated the cabin as her own, redecorating, entertaining guests, and holding what appeared to be HOA meetings from the living room that Daniel's grandfather had built by hand. She even hung a small brass plaque by the front door that read, "Whitmore Cottage." For Daniel, it was surreal. Watching her stroll through his family home wearing that satisfied smile felt like a personal insult. But he didn't act on emotion, not yet. He knew that the kind of people who hid behind HOA titles didn't crumble from confrontation. They only fell when exposed. So Daniel focused on evidence. Every night he combed through the camera footage, saving clips and organizing them by date and event. He noted the exact moment Karen moved in, when she received visitors, and when suspicious paperwork appeared. One set of clips stood out: Karen meeting with 2 HOA members, one of whom carried an envelope labeled property transfer form. They had spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing documents, laughing and signing papers. That footage was a goldmine. It proved that they weren't just maintaining the cabin. They were actively attempting to steal it. Daniel's lawyer was both astonished and furious when she saw it. She explained that what Karen was doing went far beyond an HOA dispute. It bordered on fraud, trespassing, and attempted unlawful transfer of ownership. But legal battles moved slowly, and Karen was already digging in deeper. While the case was being prepared, Daniel visited the county's property records office again to confirm everything. The records clerk, after some searching, mentioned something strange. Someone had submitted a request for ownership verification for the property, listing Daniel as non-responsive. It was clear that the HOA was building a paper trail to justify their claim. Someone had forged his unresponsiveness. That night, Daniel drove out to Clearwater again. He didn't go to confront Karen, not directly, but to retrieve something that had been left behind before she moved in. A secondary camera, one hidden inside a light fixture near the kitchen. It had no Wi-Fi connection, so it stored everything on a small SD card. If Karen hadn't found it, it could hold weeks of unseen footage. He arrived late, keeping his car parked a good distance away. The beach was quiet, only the steady whisper of waves breaking the silence. Through the trees, he could see faint light spilling from his cabin's windows. Karen was inside. A shadow moved past the blinds. She was pacing. Daniel waited until the light went out and then crept closer, his flashlight dimmed and his hood pulled tight. The sand crunched softly beneath his shoes as he approached the back wall. Careful not to make a sound, he found the old fixture just where he'd left it. The screws were rusted, but the cover came off with a gentle tug. The small camera blinked faintly. It was still recording. He slipped the SD card out and left without a trace. When he reviewed the footage later that night, he expected to see more of the same: Karen cleaning, decorating, or holding her fake HOA meetings. But what he found made his blood run cold. The hidden camera had recorded a private conversation between Karen and two men, both members of the HOA board. They were discussing ways to fast-track the ownership transfer. Karen, in her smug tone, mentioned that Daniel hadn't been around in months and that the community deserved to repurpose wasted space. Then she opened a binder filled with printed forms, all bearing Daniel's name, forged signatures, backdated notices, even a falsified abandonment report. They were building a legal fiction. Karen had gone as far as fabricating letters that claimed Daniel had been notified of the HOA's actions but failed to respond, a move that, if unnoticed, could create enough confusion to buy her time to solidify control. Every frame of that conversation was time-stamped and clear. Daniel now had proof of conspiracy. The next few days were a blur of documentation. He filed a detailed police report, submitted all his footage, and delivered the files to his lawyer. But as expected, progress was slow. The HOA had influence, and the local police seemed hesitant to interfere in what they called a civil property matter. It was infuriating, but Daniel knew better than to let that stop him. If the system moved slowly, he would use the power of exposure. Karen's ego had made her careless. She posted frequently on the Clearwater Dunes HOA Facebook group, updates, announcements, and photos of community improvements. But now, Daniel noticed that several of her posts featured his cabin. She posed in front of it, calling it a restored community retreat. In one post, she even claimed the cabin would soon serve as an HOA guest property for visiting members. That was her biggest mistake. By labeling the cabin as an HOA asset publicly, she had tied her name and her leadership directly to the illegal takeover. Her pride had become her undoing. Daniel downloaded every post, every comment, and every timestamp. The story was writing itself. Meanwhile, Karen continued her reign as if nothing was wrong. The cameras caught her hosting small gatherings, drinking wine on the porch, and bragging to her friends about her new beachfront spot. One night, the footage showed her receiving a delivery, brand new furniture being hauled inside. She had no idea she was being filmed from every angle, but the camera also caught something else that night: fear. Around midnight, Karen was seen standing by the window, holding her phone, glancing nervously at the beach. She must have sensed that something was closing in. Perhaps she'd received word of Daniel's police report. Or maybe deep down she knew she'd gone too far. Yet instead of backing down, she seemed to double down, locking the doors, installing motion lights, and even putting up a new HOA property, no trespassing sign. Daniel could only shake his head. Every move she made was another piece of evidence, another nail in her own coffin. He spent the next week organizing everything into a single, comprehensive dossier, a detailed account of the takeover, the forged documents, and the digital trail Karen had left behind. When his lawyer saw it, she told him they had enough not just for eviction, but for criminal charges. But before they could act, one last piece of footage came through, one that changed everything. On a stormy night, the cameras recorded Karen and the same two men returning to the cabin. This time they carried something heavy: boxes of papers, a portable printer, and what looked like official HOA stationery. They worked late into the night, stamping, signing, and shredding documents. It was a cleanup operation. They were destroying evidence. Daniel watched, furious but strangely calm. They were panicking, and panic meant guilt. The more they tried to cover their tracks, the deeper the hole they dug. He made one final copy of the footage and stored it safely away. The storm outside raged on, lightning flashing across the waves, and Daniel knew the real storm was about to begin. Because soon, everything Karen had stolen, forged, and faked would come crashing down, all in front of her beloved HOA board. And when it did, the whole beach would see the queen of Clearwater's HOA empire fall. The storm that had raged along Clearwater Beach the night before had left the shoreline, scattered with seaweed, driftwood, and the smell of salt-soaked earth. The waves rolled in with a quiet persistence, washing over the sand as if cleansing the coast of everything that had been tainted. But for Daniel, no storm could wash away what had been done to his family cabin. Karen Whitmore had gone too far. For weeks, he had watched her through the unblinking eye of his security cameras, lounging on his porch, hosting HOA meetings, and parading his property. As a so-called community guest house, the footage of her forging documents and discarding his belongings had already painted a clear picture of guilt. Now her latest stunt, destroying records during a stormy night, was the final nail in her own coffin. Daniel wasn't a man who sought confrontation, but the line had been crossed beyond recovery. His lawyer had filed formal charges for trespassing, property theft, and attempted fraud, and the county sheriff's office had finally agreed to investigate. The evidence Daniel provided, hours of footage, copies of forged HOA documents, and public posts from Karen herself, left little room for denial. Still, the HOA had money, and people like Karen thrived on manipulation. She was already trying to twist the narrative, posting on community boards that the cabin had been rescued from decay and reclaimed for neighborhood safety. The audacity of her words burned like acid in Daniel's mind, but he had something stronger than her arrogance: proof and patience. On the morning of the confrontation, Daniel returned to Clearwater Beach for the first time in weeks, this time not in secrecy, but with law enforcement at his side. The sheriff's vehicle followed him down the narrow coastal road, tires crunching over the sand and gravel. The sky was overcast, and the air carried that heavy pre-storm stillness that made every sound feel amplified. The creak of a wooden gate, the whisper of the wind through the dunes, and the steady hum of the sea in the distance. When the cabin came into view, it looked like a stranger's home. The shutters had been repainted. The old wooden sign with his family name was gone, replaced by a freshly carved plaque that read, "The Whitmore Beach House." Potted plants lined the porch steps. A new flag bearing the Clearwater Dunes HOA logo fluttered proudly in the salty air. Daniel felt something twist deep in his chest: anger, disbelief, and a quiet kind of grief. His grandparents had built this place by hand, board by board, as a symbol of freedom. Now it had been desecrated by entitlement. Karen was there, of course, stepping out onto the porch as if she'd been expecting him. She wore her trademark wide-brimmed sun hat and a smug expression that barely faltered when she saw the sheriff's car pull up behind Daniel's truck. She stood tall, defiant, with that practiced air of authority that had fooled so many in the HOA community. The officers approached her, paperwork in hand, while Daniel stood silently nearby, watching. The moment felt both surreal and painfully satisfying. As the officers began to question her, Karen's confidence began to falter. Daniel could see it in the subtle tightening of her jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Her excuses poured out one after another. The cabin had been neglected, the HOA had no choice, the community deserved better. But every justification unraveled the moment the sheriff mentioned the security footage. When they told her there were cameras recording every move, every forgery, and every word, her face drained of color. For the first time, the queen of Clearwater's HOA kingdom looked cornered. Daniel didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. The footage, the documents, the timeline, it all told the story of a woman who had tried to play God in a world where she held no real power. The officers entered the cabin briefly, returning moments later with confirmation. The locks had been changed, his belongings displaced, and several boxes of paperwork bearing HOA letterheads were scattered across the living room floor. It was clear this wasn't just trespassing. It was a calculated attempt to steal. Karen tried to maintain her composure, demanding to contact her attorney, insisting this was a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding anymore. The law was finally catching up to her. The sheriff ordered her to vacate the property immediately. As she gathered her things, her personal items, her paperwork, her fake sense of authority, Daniel stood near the edge of the porch, looking out at the waves. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the wind, that soft reminder of why this place mattered. It wasn't just about property. It was about legacy and principle. When Karen finally stepped off the porch, her confidence shattered. She shot Daniel a cold, venomous glance, the kind that said the war wasn't over even if she'd lost this battle. But Daniel didn't flinch. Her power had always been an illusion, built on fear and manipulation. Now stripped of her lies, she looked small against the vastness of the ocean behind her. As the sheriff's car drove away with her and the two board members she'd conspired with, Daniel finally stepped back into his cabin. The air inside was heavy with the scent of someone else's perfume, foreign and artificial. His furniture had been moved, his walls repainted, and his family photos boxed away in a corner. Yet beneath it all, the cabin still felt like home, bruised but not broken. He walked slowly through each room, taking in the damage. The kitchen table, where his grandparents once shared breakfast, was covered with HOA paperwork. The living room, where he used to fall asleep to the sound of waves, now held Karen's gaudy decor. It felt invasive, like she'd tried to rewrite his family's story and claim it as her own. But she hadn't succeeded. Daniel began restoring everything that day. He threw out her decorations, gathered his family's belongings, and scrubbed away the traces of her intrusion. Every swipe of a rag, every nail replaced, felt like reclaiming a piece of peace that had been stolen. By evening, the sky cleared, revealing the first hints of sunset. The beach glowed amber and pink, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to breathe deeply. The cabin stood quietly, proud again, its windows reflecting the soft shimmer of the sea. Yet deep down, Daniel knew the battle wasn't truly over. The HOA wasn't going to let this humiliation slide easily. Karen had allies and she had influence. Her pride wouldn't allow her to disappear quietly. There would be appeals, meetings, and perhaps even smear campaigns. People like her didn't go down without trying to drag others with them. Still, Daniel was ready. He had everything he needed: legal protection, evidence, and the truth. And if the HOA tried to retaliate, they'd find that the man they thought was absent had been watching all along. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Daniel turned off the lights inside his reclaimed home. The cameras still watched silently, their lenses fixed on the porch, a reminder that vigilance was the reason he'd won. Karen's flag lay crumpled in the sand outside, torn loose by the wind. The HOA's emblem fluttered weakly before being swallowed by the tide. It was poetic, almost as if the sea itself was reclaiming what had been taken. Daniel stood at the window, watching the waves in silence, knowing that peace had returned, at least for now. But beneath the calm surface of Clearwater Beach, the current of HOA politics still stirred restlessly. And soon enough, Karen's next move would reveal itself. The war for the cabin might be over, but the war for justice in Clearwater Dunes was only beginning. The theme after the confrontation at Clearwater Beach was deceptive, like the eerie stillness that follows a hurricane before the next storm rolls in. The beach cabin, once again under Daniel's rightful ownership, stood quiet against the endless hum of the ocean. Yet beneath the serenity, tension lingered. The HOA's grip on the community might have been shaken, but it was far from broken. In the days following Karen's removal, the neighborhood was abuzz with gossip. Word spread fast along the rows of pastel-colored houses that the HOA president had been escorted away by law enforcement. Some residents pretended not to know the details, while others whispered about corruption and falsified documents. For the first time in years, the residents of Clearwater Dunes were beginning to question the authority that had ruled them through fear and fines. Karen had been the face of that authority, and her downfall had exposed the cracks in the system she built. But she wasn't the kind of woman to fade quietly into obscurity. Within a week, the HOA board released a carefully worded statement to the community. It described Karen's temporary suspension as part of an internal review, blaming administrative misunderstandings and procedural miscommunication. It was a classic deflection, the kind that protected the organization while throwing Karen under the bus just enough to appease the angry residents. Daniel read the letter with bitter amusement. It was a sanitized version of the truth. No mention of trespassing, no mention of forged property transfers, and certainly no mention of the fact that the so-called abandoned cabin had never been abandoned at all. He could have left it at that. He had his cabin back. The locks had been changed again, the cameras were upgraded, and the interior was slowly being restored to its old charm. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man to walk away when justice was unfinished. Karen's scheme had nearly cost him his family's legacy. And now he wanted to ensure it never happened to anyone else. So he did what the HOA feared most: he went public. Daniel compiled all the footage, documents, and photos into a single, organized case file. Every moment of Karen's trespassing, every forged form, every HOA notice she had pinned to his door, it was all there, time-stamped and undeniable. Then, with the help of his lawyer, he submitted it to both local media and a state housing commission. The story exploded faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, online articles began circulating with headlines like HOA president accused of seizing private property under false pretenses and beach cabin scandal Clearwater Dunes, HOA under investigation. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a viral headline about HOA overreach and power abuse. Residents who had once been silent began coming forward with their own stories. Tales of unfair fines, intimidation, and property threats that had gone unchallenged for years. The Clearwater Dunes HOA was no longer a symbol of order. It had become a case study in corruption, and at the center of it all was Karen Whitmore. As the investigation deepened, more details surfaced. Financial records showed irregularities in HOA spending, maintenance funds unaccounted for, inflated invoices for community projects, and personal expenses that led directly back to Karen and a few loyal board members. The so-called abandoned property program that had been used to justify seizing Daniel's cabin had quietly targeted other vacant lots, most of which conveniently ended up in the hands of Karen's friends or associates. The scam had been bigger than anyone imagined. Meanwhile, Karen herself had gone into damage control. Through her lawyer, she issued a statement, claiming that she had acted in the community's best interest, that she had been misled by incomplete information, and that Daniel's property had appeared derelict and unsafe. But those excuses crumbled once the footage went public. Millions of people watched the clips online. Karen inspecting the cabin, moving in her belongings, holding meetings, and even shredding documents in the dead of night. The internet had no mercy for her. She became the face of HOA corruption, labeled online as Beach House Karen. Her reputation collapsed overnight. Daniel, however, didn't take pleasure in her humiliation. What he wanted was accountability, not revenge. And as the state launched a formal investigation, it became clear that accountability was finally coming. The HOA board was disbanded pending review, their finances frozen, and Karen was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and trespassing. But even in disgrace, Karen refused to accept defeat. Through the grapevine, Daniel heard that she had started blaming everyone else: the board, her assistants, even the very community she once controlled. In private emails leaked to reporters, she claimed she had been targeted by outsiders and betrayed by neighbors. It was denial, pure and desperate. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't vanish quietly. Their pride wouldn't let them. And sure enough, one afternoon, while Daniel was working on the porch of the cabin, he noticed something odd. A small envelope was tucked beneath the doorframe. No postage, no return address, just a single sheet of paper inside. It was a handwritten note, neatly folded, with his name on the front. When he opened it, the words were short, written in a familiar looping script. "You might have won the battle, but the beach belongs to the HOA. Enjoy your view while you can." No signature, but Daniel didn't need one. He knew exactly who had written it. Karen was gone from office, stripped of her authority and her reputation, but her obsession hadn't ended. It was a warning, a final attempt to intimidate him. Daniel didn't report the note to the police. Instead, he added it to the growing file of evidence. It was proof once again of her refusal to take responsibility. Proof that she still believed she could control what wasn't hers. But this time, Daniel wasn't afraid. He had the law, the public, and the truth on his side. The cameras were still rolling, sharper and more secure than ever. Every angle of the property was covered, every door reinforced, every inch of the beach monitored. Karen could threaten, but she could no longer touch what she had lost. As the weeks passed, the HOA investigation expanded beyond Clearwater Dunes. State regulators began auditing other communities run by the same management firm. Similar abandonment claims were discovered elsewhere, a network of deceit that stretched beyond Karen's personal greed. Her scandal had sparked something larger, a reckoning. For Daniel, It was strange to think that his quiet beach cabin had become the catalyst for statewide HOA reform. But as he sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the waves, he realized that some battles weren't fought just for yourself. They were fought for everyone who'd been too afraid to stand up before. Still, there was one loose end. Karen had vanished from public view. No one had seen her in town for weeks. Her house sat empty, her phone disconnected. Rumors swirled. Some said she had fled the area, others claimed she was preparing a lawsuit. Daniel didn't care much either way, as long as she stayed away. But one night, just as he began to believe peace had truly returned, one of his security cameras pinged with a motion alert. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. The feed showed the beach, dark, empty, save for the silver glint of moonlight over the waves. Then for just a second, a shadow moved near the edge of the porch. A figure standing still, watching the cabin. The camera caught only a blur, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Karen, she stood there for several seconds before turning and walking away into the dunes. Daniel stared at the footage for a long time. There was no fear this time, only resolve. Whatever game Karen thought she was still playing, she was walking into her own downfall. The cameras had caught her once before, and they would again if she ever dared return. The next morning, Daniel sent the clip to the sheriff's office. The war for the cabin was almost over, but the final act was still to come. And this time, there would be no second chances for Karen Whitmore. The night Karen returned to the beach was the night Daniel realized the story wasn't just about property anymore. It was about control. For years, she had built her power through intimidation and deceit. Losing that power had stripped away the only identity she ever had. And now, even after being exposed, arrested, and disgraced, she couldn't let go. The camera footage from that night was grainy, but unmistakable. The figure in the frame lingered on the edge of the dunes, staring at the cabin with the intensity of someone obsessed. She didn't step onto the porch or try the door. She just stood there watching, as if trying to remind him that she was still there, that she could still unsettle him. But Daniel wasn't the same man who had walked into this battle months ago. He had gone from being a private cabin owner to a whistleblower who helped uncover a state-level fraud network. He had dealt with threats, lies, and media attention. Karen's shadow, once terrifying, now looked small in comparison. Still, he knew he couldn't ignore it. He forwarded the footage to the sheriff's department, attaching it to his existing case file. Within hours, a deputy confirmed they were adding it to the ongoing investigation. They had already been tracking Karen's movements since her release on bail, and this video placed her back near a property she was legally ordered to stay away from. It was a direct violation of her restraining order. 2 days later, law enforcement picked her up. Neighbors reported seeing the squad car pull up to her house early in the morning. No sirens, no shouting, just the quiet, efficient end to a long and messy story. Karen was taken into custody for trespassing, violating a court order, and interfering with an active investigation. And just like that, her final act of defiance had sealed her fate. The story spread quickly online once more. The same channels that had covered Daniel's footage months before now released updates with titles like Beach Cabin Karen Returns and Gets Arrested Again. The internet, ever hungry for drama, pounced on every detail. But this time, the tone was different. The world wasn't mocking or entertained anymore. It was tired. People had seen enough of her arrogance. As for Daniel, the attention didn't thrill him. What mattered most was that the beach was finally quiet again. In the weeks that followed, Clearwater Dunes changed. The HOA board was officially dissolved, replaced by an interim management group supervised by a state housing commission. Financial audits revealed years of mismanagement. Missing funds, fake maintenance contracts, and hidden accounts tied to Karen's personal credit cards. Several former board members were charged alongside her, though none had been as deeply involved in the property schemes as she was. For the first time in years, the community began to heal. The new management group made immediate reforms, public transparency for every expense, open meetings for residents, and a strict limit on HOA authority. Homeowners who had lived in fear of fines or retaliation were finally free to enjoy their properties without walking on eggshells. Some residents even reached out to Daniel, thanking him quietly for standing up. They told him that if he hadn't fought back, no one else would have dared to. His case had inspired others across the state to file complaints, leading to investigations into other HOAs that had operated the same way. It turned out that Karen's downfall had been the first domino in a much larger reckoning. Meanwhile, Daniel's cabin, once the center of chaos, became his sanctuary again. The repairs were complete. The sanded floors gleamed and the sea breeze carried the same gentle salt scent he remembered from childhood. The cameras remained not out of fear anymore, but as a reminder of what he had overcome. Every morning he'd step out onto the porch with his coffee and look out at the waves. The ocean had always been there, unchanged through every storm and scandal. It was humbling in a way to realize how small all of it really was compared to the endless horizon. But the quiet didn't mean it was over entirely. The court hearings dragged on for months. Karen tried everything to avoid the inevitable: appeals, motions, character witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Between the forged documents, the surveillance footage, and the testimonies of those she had bullied, her defense collapsed. In the end, she was sentenced to several years of probation and community service, along with a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in the state. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the victims of her schemes, including Daniel, for damages and legal fees. It wasn't prison, but it was fitting. For someone who had built her identity on power, her punishment was powerlessness. Months later, Daniel received a check in the mail, a partial payment from the court settlement. It wasn't much compared to the stress and time he had lost, but it was symbolic, a final acknowledgement that he had been wronged and that the system had finally worked the way it was supposed to. He framed the letter that came with it, the one bearing the court seal, and hung it inside the cabin, right by the front door where Karen had once pinned her fake abandonment notice. It was poetic justice. As time went on, the internet moved on too. New scandals replaced old ones. New Karens emerged in different neighborhoods, and Daniel's story became part of a larger discussion about HOA overreach and property rights. He didn't mind fading from the headlines. He hadn't done it for fame or clicks. He had done it to protect something personal: the piece of land his grandfather had built with his own hands, the same one where generations of his family had gathered every summer. Now, it was safe again. One evening, nearly a year after the entire ordeal began, Daniel walked down the familiar wooden steps to the beach. The sun was setting, casting the waves in gold and crimson. The tide was gentle, the sand cool beneath his feet. He looked back at the cabin, restored, secure, and standing proudly against the backdrop of palm trees and seagrass. The cameras glinted faintly in the fading light, silent sentinels guarding his peace. He thought about everything that had happened: the deceit, the confrontation, the media frenzy, and finally, the justice. It had been exhausting, but it had also reaffirmed something he had almost forgotten: that standing your ground, even against overwhelming odds, mattered. As he turned back toward the water, he saw a small shape bobbing in the surf, a weathered wooden plank washed up by the tide. It looked old, maybe a remnant of some forgotten pier or storm damage. He picked it up and noticed faint, hand-carved letters on the surface: home. He smiled. Sometimes the universe had its own way of writing endings. Daniel carried the plank back up to the porch and leaned it by the door. It wasn't much, just a piece of driftwood with a message that felt perfectly timed. The HOA was gone. The cabin was his. The beach was quiet, and Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed guardian of community order, had finally been exposed for what she truly was. The waves rolled in steady and calm as the last light disappeared beneath the horizon. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the peace he'd been fighting for. Not the temporary kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from resolution. The cameras stayed up. The ocean kept moving. The cabin stood firm. Justice had been served, and the beach was finally irrevocably his again.